I want to begin today's talk with less of a focus on explicit integration of psychology with theology, even though that is what this series is about, and more on the psychology of religion. Now, there's some reasons for doing this, and I'll try to explain those. And today, I'm going to talk about just some basic issues facing the psychology of religion in the context of what I'm going to call religiously inflected experiences. Tomorrow's lecture and the lecture on Friday will apply some of the principles I talk about today, but this is in some ways getting at some of the basics. But on tomorrow, we'll be talking about the psychological study of grace, and on Friday, we'll be looking at the virtues of humility and gratitude. Now, one reason why I take this approach is that it more directly gets at the basic premise that's underlying this series of lectures. Namely, that there is, I believe, a discernible shift in the psychology of religion, and part of that is due to some of the work that's being done here at Fuller, and it's largely due to the effect of multiculturalism that we are increasingly recognizing and are sensitive to in our culture, though I think we still have a ways to go. And I think that these changes are going to force the psychology of religion to better account for the substance of religious belief and practice. And in so doing, this provides an unusual opportunity for integrationists to impact not only the psychology of religion, but because religion is so central to so many people in society, I think the discipline as a whole is beginning to recognize as well the importance of religious experience to the total person. To take advantage of this opportunity, I think we're going to have to reassess just how we are going to go about doing integration work. And so I propose that we intentionally adopt what I'm going to call, for lack of a better term, experiential integration approach. And I need to remember to do these. And I do want to acknowledge the John Templeton Foundation. It was mentioned in the introduction, but they have been so generous and have provided so much support of my work. And I just simply want to recognize that. So let's talk a little bit about rethinking integration. An experiential integration approach should not replace, but rather should complement how we traditionally view integration. The traditional view is what I'll call propositional integration. Again, there's nothing magical about these terms. These are just some terms that I've come up with. But I'm using these terms in a specific way. By propositional, I mean an understanding and emphasis on how we should conduct our integration efforts that are faithful to what we believe are theologically and scientifically correct. This requires a high level of both psychological and theological expertise that very few of us, in all honesty, can master, so this has to be a communal effort. And I'm so happy that, for instance, folks from the theology school here are contributing to this Integration Symposium. In the early years of what I'm going to call contemporary integration, Hendrika van de Kemp was always good to remind us that integration has gone back hundreds of years, literally into the 1800s. But contemporary integration, and by that I'm really thinking, sort of that movement that began in the 70s, particularly with journals like the Journal of Psychology and Theology, Journal of Psychology and Christianity, and then, of course, the development of programs like Fuller and Rosemead in psychology, that in those early years, much of the effort centered around different models of integration that involved doing good psychology and good theology that somehow, when they were brought together into a unified whole, were believed to more accurately reflect truth through the lens of a Christian worldview. This effort continues today. It's part of the programs that we have at schools like Fuller. It's also still found in those journals that I just made reference to, and is witnessed by such books as the Five Views book that's often used in different Christian programs of psychology. Continuing these efforts is crucial I'm not saying that we should do away with this approach at all. It's crucial, for they keep us accountable and are indispensable in educating a new generation of Christian psychologists and a more educated lay public. By experiential, I mean an understanding of how people actually live their lives psychologically and theologically. Christians, or for that matter, anyone who takes their faith seriously, are both implicit psychologists, and here I make reference to the work of Fritz Heider in social psychology back in, I believe it was published in 1958, so it's a while ago now, where he says we really are all psychologists, whether we get training or not in the field of psychology. Because we're always, in the area of social psychology, we're always reading people. We're always trying to understand people and also trying to understand ourselves in a social context. So the argument is that we are implicit psychologists, but I would like to add that for Christians, we're also implicit theologians. That is, though most of us are not formally trained, not most of us here, but most people who identify with the faith are not formally trained in either psychology or theology. They nevertheless employ psychological and theological principles to better understand their own existence, sometimes intentionally and perhaps rationally, but more likely unintentionally and irrationally, not necessarily irrationally, although sometimes that might apply as well. This, I suggest, is yet another form of integration, what I'm calling an experiential integration, to which psychology plays the leading role. It is, if you will, a folk psychology of religion that implicitly employs principles of integration. Such employment may not necessarily be good integration, as propositionally defined, but it is nonetheless integration. I also suggest that psychology must, by necessity, take the leading role in this process, since it is probably the most capable discipline in addressing the experiential process. In turn, I think this has major implications for the psychology of religion, which in turn then has implications for how we might do integration. One thing I've learned from my colleagues who are good qualitative researchers is that it's important for the investigator, or for that matter, the individual who is presenting a talk, such as what I'm doing here, to disclose information about himself or herself. Not such that to try to impress, or not as a claim for authority or of status or anything, but simply to set the tone for conversation. Now, you would think, as a social psychologist, I would have learned this a long time ago, but I didn't. I haven't learned it until more recently in my career. Some people are slow learners. But up front, I want to mention a few things about myself as to why my focus, at least initially here, is on the psychology of religion rather than what I would call explicit integration. Throughout my career, I've tried to keep one foot in the integration waters, and 1 foot grounded in the psychology of religion. And so as many of the things where I was introduced, I've been a longtime member of CAPS. In fact, as I was writing this, I went back, a little bit of note-taking I do. I don't really keep a journal. It's not nearly that coherent, but a little bit of note-taking that I do. And I discovered since 1988, that year that Al and I sat together at a banquet, that I've only missed one CAPS conference. And that was only because the CAPS board asked me to represent CAPS at another conference that happened to be on the same weekend. So I think I probably would have made that one as well. And part of that is because of my role as journal editor for the Journal of Psychology and Christianity, which is owned by CAPS. But I have that sort of connection. It's that sort of home to me. But I also have another home, and that home is in Division 36. At least structurally, it's and organizationally, it's through Division 36 of the American Psychological Association. And at times, these two coexist with perhaps some tension by living in both worlds that I experience. Of course, the two are not independent of each other, but there are differences. One difference is that in the psychology of religion, or more appropriately for psychology, religiousness, is the object of study, whereas in integration, religiousness is part of the process of study. The religion scholar Ann Taves goes so far as to maintain that the psychology of religion and what she calls religious psychology, which I would say is very close to what we're talking about as integration of psychology and theology, are really two very different approaches in evaluating the legitimacy of religious experiences. The differences in approach are understood along two dimensions. One dimension is natural versus supernatural origins, okay? And the second dimension is secular versus religious interpretations of those origins. In her view, the psychology of religion interprets religious experience in secular scientific terms that is attributed to natural causes. And natural causes only in its most radical or extreme form, she would say. Whereas religious psychology, or again, maybe our language would be integration, consists essentially of religious, this is her language now, of religious apologists who interpret religious experiences in terms of a supernatural origin. I think there is an element of truth to what she suggests, though I think she has overstated the case. The happy medium, and this is what she's really proposing, according to Taves, is the effort to study religious interpretations to events with natural origins, what she calls deeming things religious. And she argues that probably the best exemplary of that is William James. Now, allow me to go back to a little autobiography here. I do think of myself as a psychologist of religion with an insider perspective. Such a position is both an advantage and a disadvantage. The fact that I am a Christian, including being the product of a Christian home, a great home, allows me to appreciate the role that culture plays in religious and spiritual experience. It gives me, I think, some perspective on this topic, at least in terms of how it operates in my own culture, that someone from outside the culture just might not get. My culture forms and defines much of my religious schema. I had to learn this understanding, however, and I have to continue to learn this understanding because it's very easy to think that the norm within one's culture is the norm within every culture. It is in this sense that my insider position is a disadvantage, and therefore something I need to recognize and to do something about. For me personally, it meant expanding my professional network and to include people from other religious traditions, including co-authoring papers with some of these individuals. And the irony is that as I learn more from my Buddhist, my Islamic, and my Jewish friends about their tradition, I also learn more about my own religious culture with an ever-growing appreciation for the rich heritage of which I enjoy. But this also means that it is sometimes difficult to live in both the psychology of religion and the integration world, especially if the two approaches are as contradictory as Taves suggests. I don't think they are. Again, there are some differences. But I also think it's what's demanded of me and of all of us as Christians, because we are called to be salt and light to the world. Taves' typology infers motivation, and something I just want to kind of bracket for today's discussion. But I will just say a word about that. And what I want to say is that regardless of the motivation of the researcher to either explain religion, as in the case of psychology of religion, and for some, they think explaining religion away, or to defend the legitimacy of religious experience, in the case of Taves' description, what she calls religious psychology. The process of doing good scientific research, and I would add not just the empirical research, but the theoretical conceptualization that undergirds such research should remain intact. TAV's mediating position, which studies how religious people apply religious interpretations even to events with natural origins, much like the example that President Lamberton mentioned earlier. But that's crucial to the psychology experience, not only to natural causes, even if it were true only to natural causes, it still behooves the investigator to try to understand the experience as an object of study, not on his or her own terms, but on the terms of the individual who claims to have the experience. That is, those people who do apply religious interpretations even to events with natural origins. Given that, first of all, there is a large body of individuals in North America and throughout the world who still hold to some sort of classical theism within the Christian tradition, and given that a majority of these individuals, and there's some survey work that shows this, claim that religion and or Christian spirituality are important or very important in their lives, it is proposed here that a Christian theologically informed psychology of religion is fully justified and necessary to the integrity of the field, not only the psychology of religion, but because religion is so important to folks, I would extend that to the field as a whole. The emerging understanding of religion as culture provides an unusual opportunity for integration to impact the psychology of religion and perhaps the field as a whole. With this opportunity, however, comes responsibility. And who is more capable to understand the culture of classical Christian theism, which, by the way, is a growing culture worldwide, maybe not here in the United States, but worldwide, and certainly not in Western Europe. But given who is more capable to understand the culture of classical Christian theism than those who take seriously an integrationist framework? And who is better trained to do this than those from the Fullers, the Rosemeads, the APUs, the Wheatons, the George Foxes, and other institutions, as well as to folks from Fresno Pacific on the undergraduate level. Appreciate you folks being here. I think it's a great class that has been developed there in bringing this symposium as a central feature of that class. Okay, so let's deal with this term religiously inflected experience for just a moment. I'll focus much on this term, and this is similar to what Taves called deeming things religious. You see, to say that something is inflected is to say, and by the way, I didn't put this up on the slide. It is in the script that I'm working from, but I'm borrowing this term from Miroslav Volf at Yale University, who has started to use this term in some of his own thinking. But to say that something is inflected is to say that it has been modified by the influence of something else. Thus, you can have a politically inflected play that because of political overtones, the interpretation of the play has been affected. Here I'm suggesting that the religious person's experience of the world, even some ordinary experiences of the world, will be influenced by his or her religious worldview or schema. Now, in itself, this claim may not seem very radical or insightful, and indeed, it's not, in that it involves an assumption that I think has been a long-standing assumption among integrationists. It's a staple. However, this approach does involve a subtle shift, but an important shift in the psychology of religion that gives rise to the importance of the substance of religious and spiritual belief, and thus provides an enhanced opportunity for integrationists to make a meaningful contribution to the field. When psychologists focus on extraordinary religious experiences, the tendency is to focus on the functional value of the experience. And perhaps this is no better illustrated than the work of William James, and I'll only briefly talk about James in just a few moments. But he's well known, of course, for taking a functionalist approach to the whole of psychology, not just the psychology of religion. But as it applies to the psychology of religion, some common examples of a functional approach, which I'm saying is well and good. I'm not downplaying a functional approach. But some examples would be the literature on religious coping, or attachment to God processes, or spiritual struggle, or some of the literature on religion and psychopathology. The value of religious participation, the support networks that we receive from institutional religion, and of course many applied areas in the field such as marriage, health, morality, and so forth. And again, there's nothing wrong, but taking only a functional approach, as many psychologists are prone to do, can only take the field so far. The substance of a person's belief also greatly matters. Thus, it is important that psychologists study not only that a person believes something, but also what a person believes. And this is why I'm particularly heartened, I should say, not heightened, I'm not that tall, by the recent developments in the cognitive science of religion, where topics such as how one thinks about or experiences God are the focus of empirical study. It's more than just saying that a person believes in God, but rather how does that person both know about God, and in more experiential terms, how does that person think that they know God? So why the focus also on the ordinary? That might be a question that you've asked. And this might seem almost counterintuitive in that experimental research on the ordinary is often what we don't do. We usually look for extreme groups on something to study. Why? Because we're more likely to come up with more robust findings. But let's face it, most of psychology should be focused on the ordinary. And it's because, whether religious or not, most of us just live ordinary lives. Most of my Monday is not that different from the Monday of my neighbor, whether that person be an atheist, a Christian, or somewhere in between. From my house, I get a beautiful view of the Santa Rosa Mountains. Most of the people in my neighborhood get the same view. We see it every day. And in that sense, what might have been initially an overwhelming experience, as it was in my case of the mountain range's splendor and glory, it over time can become ordinary. What influence does that ordinary experience then have on my appreciation of the majestic beauty that stares at me? Now, my wife and I have only lived in this house for a couple of months, so I'm still sort of taken up with this. But I wonder if after 15 years and some 5,500 times of waking up to the same view, if I'm going to lose some of that sense of that splendor and that glory. Now, I use this as an example on purpose. It's intentional, in that those mountains have been there for millions of years. And depending upon your view, if not entirely of natural origin, they are certainly the product of what I see as many natural processes. Yet, as I also suggested, I also see these mountains reflecting splendor and glory. That for me, sometimes, not always, but sometimes becomes a religious or spiritual experience in that it employs a religious interpretation. That said, even the devoutly religious among us focus directly on the sacred only a small percentage of our lives. We'll spend more time eating or preparing to eat, making money so we can buy groceries, so we can prepare the food so we can eat. Then we spend on the experiences of objects that are in some sense religious or spiritual, be it God, sacraments, sacred writings, and the like. And just what I will call the possible organization, I have trouble even pronouncing it. It's a made-up word. You would think I would, if I'm going to make up a word, it ought to be one that I can pronounce. It's not ordination. I'm not saying that. Okay, organization. And by that, I just simply mean making ordinary. Okay. Over time of my experiences of the Santa Rosa Mountains, so too does much of our faith life take on an ordinary character. And in so doing, does religious faith lose its grip on our lives? Does such faith matter in our ordinary daily living? Well, not surprisingly, I'm going to answer that faith does matter, that question, does faith matter, in the affirmative. Yes, for the religiously committed individual, religious faith does matter, regardless of how extraordinary or ordinary the living experience is. However, in making this case, I want to focus primarily on just the ordinary experience of life, because I think this approach best hits the mark of what it means to live a spiritual life most fully. In turn, I think this will have important implications for the integration of psychology and theology. I'm going to skip over a little bit here for sake of time. So what I want to do is I do want to take a few moments to look at the work of William James, and as it applies to this basic premise that I've been talking about. I'll also think a little bit about methodological implications of studying religiously inflected experiences. I'm going to try to tie some of this discussion into understanding religion as a meaning-making system, and then I'll bring it back to integration. And again, these are just some basic principles. The application of these principles will come tomorrow in our discussion of grace, and on Friday in our discussion of the virtues of humility and gratitude. So let's talk a little bit, briefly, about William James. The approach I'm suggesting does have its root in James. In his Gifford Lectures that were published collectively, it was a series of lectures in 1902, as the varieties of religious experience, James referred to the hot place in a man's consciousness, and I'm quoting him right now, the group of ideas to which he devotes himself and from which he works. And he calls this the habitual center of personal energy, the hot place in a man's consciousness, the group of ideas to which he devotes himself and from which he works. According to James, it makes a great difference, and this is that quotation that you see on the slide, to a man whether one set of his ideas or another be the center of his energy. And it makes a great difference as regard any set of ideas which he may possess, whether they become central or remain peripheral in him. I think that should be to him. I think that's a misquotation. To say that a man is converted, which is a major interest of James, means in these terms that religious ideas, previously peripheral in his consciousness, now take a central place, and that religious aims form the habitual center of his energy. Of course, he wrote this in 1902 and didn't have all of the concerns about just use of the masculine gender, so I'm quoting him as he said it back then. For James, the religious convert who has undergone a spiritual transformation has moved the sense of meaning from an autonomous centeredness to a sacred mooring. And it is that mooring that becomes the reference point from which one interprets his or her world of experience. Now, I'm going to skip over some things that I have in my script, but I'll just paraphrase them briefly, and that is that there has been some criticism of James because he tended to insist on noting the unusual or the extreme in religious experience to the neglect of the piety of the ordinary person. And actually, there have been times when I have defended James on this notion, because I have also argued that one of the things that we've neglected in the psychology of religion is the study of affect and how important affect is. And of course, part of that is because probably the study of affect is the hardest area, one of the hardest areas, at least for psychology to study very well and to measure in particular. So psychologists of religion also have tended to underemphasize the role of affect, which is what James was really strongly suggesting in the varieties. But on the other hand, today, I'm sort of taking the other approach. Yes, let's think about the ordinary. Okay, let's not just think about the extreme examples. And so if you've read James at all, you know that that many of the examples he provided were extreme examples, often from pamphlets and materials that he gathered, often from generations that were even bygone at the time of his writing. But the most relevant notion for our purposes here is James' notion of religion as the habitual center of personal energy. If indeed religious or spiritual experience is at the center of our thoughts, feelings, and actions, especially in terms of what motivates us or propels us, in other words, our personal energy, then religious inflections of experiences, whether they be ordinary or extraordinary, should be of paramount importance. You cannot study such inflections without getting at their substance. And this has important implications for how we are going to go about doing our work. So what I'm going to do now is talk a little bit about some implications for research and how we should go about doing our work. Psychologists of religion have primarily taken an etic approach to their subject matter. Etic approaches focus on variables that are assumed to exist and be valid across religious traditions and cultures. And in many cases, it is assumed or at least suggested that these variables operate in some unitary fashion that are universally true. While there may be some value to this approach, especially, and I think there could be some value, especially when you're talking about basic psychological processes, such as some basic cognition as a process. But I think if you take that too far, I think it's a misguided effort overall for the psychology of religion. Instead, I recommend that the field be more open to adopting an emic approach, especially if my call to study religiously inflected experiences is to be taken seriously. Emic approaches take into account what might be unique to individual religious cultures, and in that sense, we can say that they are religion-dependent. And I'll use two quick examples, and again, I'm just going to summarize these for sake of time, just how prevalent an etic approach is in the psychology of religion. The first example is in the measurement in the psychology of religion and spirituality. And in 1999, Ralph Hood and I published a compendium, we edited a compendium of measures in the psychology of religion. And it was about 125 different scales. We had copies of the scales themselves. That was what I think was most valuable for users of the book, as well as brief reviews, largely non-evaluative reviews, just try to be descriptive reviews of the scales themselves, what they were intended to measure, what validity did they report, reliability, all of the basic psychometric considerations that go into measurement. And then, did they catch on? Did people actually use the measures? And some we found were used, some quite frequently, and some never saw the light of day. A couple of mine. But anyway, and most of these measures were, unsurprisingly, a self-report type, and most were etic measures. In other words, they're trying to get at something that extends beyond cultural bounds. The measures that were emic in nature were mostly from within a conservative Protestant perspective, largely because that was the group that has been studied the most. And rather than applauding, I should say, the emic efforts of researchers, this instead led to a criticism of both conceptualization and measurement in the field as a Protestant bias. Now, descriptively, I think that's true. Okay? There is a Protestant bias in the literature because that's where most of the research has been done, and probably most of the researchers themselves have been influenced by a Protestant culture here in North America. But there was an underlying reasoning of at least some critics that is flawed here, in that they called for measures that could be validly applied to all religious traditions, thus furthering an etic approach, not an emic approach. So it was not unusual for me to get emails, especially in the early years after that book was published, but even I still get them, saying, just tell me what measure I can use that is free of the baggage of religion, okay? Trying to get at spirituality somehow. And I have a line that I just paste in now because I got that so often, okay, which said, I don't think such a measure exists. It was more polite than that, but I think that was a misguided question. Second example, finding meaning in suffering. Here I'm drawing on some of the work of Liz Hall, my colleague at Rosemead, and some of her colleagues. That was just published recently in 2018. And they were interested in how religion contributes to meaning-making among people who suffer from difficult life circumstances, mostly health-related circumstances. So what they did, they identified almost 1,500 studies in PsycInfo by crossing the specific religious terms in their search. And these were the terms they used: Christian or Catholic or Jewish or Muslim or Hindu, with the word meaning. From the study's abstracts, they filtered this list by investigating meaning in the context of difficult life circumstances. So that brought it down quite a bit, but unfortunately, and I meant to ask Liz, but I forgot to, I don't know how far that brought it down. It wasn't reported in the study itself. But here's, I think, the most important. I think it's safe to say that it brought the number down quite a bit, but not way, way down. Okay, there still were a lot of studies looking at people under difficult life circumstances, be they financial, physical, health, whatever. But when they applied an emic criterion in terms of the constructs being studied and the measures being used to their search, they found a grand total of only 16 studies that met all criteria. Thus, it appears that emic approaches in the psychology of religion are underutilized. And I should also point out that all 16 studies identified by Hall were qualitative studies. An emic approach will likely require that we better use qualitative measures in the psychology of religion. Specifically, the study of religiously inflected experiences will likely necessitate qualitative work, or at least more qualitative work. Now, I do believe that we can develop emic quantitative measures as well, but we have to be very sensitive to the context in which we're working. I was going to talk a little bit about the importance of what I'm calling proximal measures versus distal measures in the psychology of religion. It's proximal measures that are really getting much more at the religious, at the experience itself. And what we have discovered, particularly in the area of religion and health, that when you get at more proximal measures of religion and spirituality, you find that much stronger findings. They're more robust predictors of health-related issues than are more general measures like just simply, do you believe in God? Or, do you consider yourself religious? Or how important is religion? So, and it's taken time because much of the literature, and often that's because religion is an add-on variable. You see, it's often research in health-related fields, often published in medical journals, and religion just kind of gets added on as maybe one important variable. I think that's changing, and I think it's because of some of the research that's coming out. But when usually it's just a one or two item measure that we use, and it's a very distal measure. It's not closely related at all. So hopefully that will change in that field, and I think it is. So with that in mind, I'd like to move on to yet another topic. And again, I recognize there might seem to be some incoherence here, but I think all of these are eventually like spokes on a wheel sort of coming together at a particular hub that's here. And that is meaning-making and religion. So I'm suggesting that psychologists will only prolong errors of the past if they choose, as they often are prone to do, to decontextualize the phenomenon of interest. In our case here today, religious and spiritual experience. Probably nowhere is this more pronounced than in how people make meaning of their lives. Religions provide the most encompassing and coherent meaning systems, in part because they are so directly accessible. And we tried to make this case, Ralph Hood, Paul Williamson, and I, in the book that Brad mentioned at the beginning, The Psychology of Fundamentalism, okay? And we've been criticized of that book that we were too apologetic of fundamentalists. But we also have argued that, no, we've only been studying fundamentalists on our terms as psychologists. And we haven't really understood. We haven't gotten to know the fundamentalists. And I'm going to talk, I'll give you a quotation from Ralph Hood tomorrow that I think is just hits it on the mark so well. But at any rate, that's for tomorrow. Back to this notion of meaning making. A person conceptualizes, experiences, and expresses human meaning through a Wittgensteinian grammar, some larger belief structure that need not necessarily be explicit, but nevertheless it provides an integrative narrative for the person. For example, when applied to a view of virtuous flourishing, this grammar will help define the kind of life lived by someone who possesses the virtue in question. And here, that's part of that quotation that's on the slide from Bob Roberts. Ignoring the larger belief structure will yield a substantially inadequate analysis. This is true in meaning making, and I'll give you an example in just a moment. For the spiritual or religious person, the grammar of meaning and virtue will be embedded either within a formal religious tradition or in some other system of thought and experience that facilitates a spiritual sense. So the example I want to point to is the work by Crystal Park. And Crystal has provided a widely recognized meaning-making model that provides an organizing framework, not only for our discussion, but she's actually applied it primarily to the study of religious experience. The larger belief structure, the Wittgensteinian grammar just mentioned, is what Park calls global meaning. And it consists of beliefs, okay, and these would be the broadly encompassing assumptions that helps people structure their understanding of the world. For the religious person, of course, that means beliefs about such things as human nature, sin, views of God, the afterlife. So we have beliefs that are part of global meaning. We also have goals that are part of global meaning. I'm sorry I didn't really list all of these. Higher level ideals that we contain, that consist of in our experience of things. These are states that people aspire to. For the Christian, this might be to inculcate the virtues demonstrated in the life of Christ, such as the fruit of the Spirit. So we have beliefs, we have goals, we also have feelings, she says, that are part of global meaning. This is experiencing a sense of meaning or purpose in life. For the religious person, this might include the desire to glorify God. However, in everyday life, we encounter situations that require an interpretation. This is what Park calls situational meaning, for which one's global meaning provides a framework. In so doing, we may encounter events that are unusually stressful or traumatic that violate our global meaning system, thus creating a distressful discrepancy to which one is forced to make sense of. To reduce this discrepancy, one might make changes in one's global meaning. For example, questioning God's love or power in light of a cancer diagnosis. Or one might reappraise the situation as a form of assimilation to the existing global meaning system, potentially even strengthening the system, such as peace or dependency on God or intimacy on God, even through the distressful experience. It is possible that it is the robustness of the extraordinary event that may cause one to question, regardless of result, the global meaning system. But I think for ordinary life experiences, the global meaning system works very efficiently, and I don't really have empirical data. I think this is an empirical question. Just how efficient is the global meaning system to maintain a sense of coherence, a sense of purpose, a sense of value, and a sense of efficacy, the four dimensions that I think make up meaning in life. So in conclusion, today's lecture is designed to set the stage for two lectures, the next two lectures presented in the next 2 days, when we look at the applied topics of grace and humility and gratitude. In this process, I joined the chorus, calling for a culture-specific psychology of religion. This does not suggest that psychologists of religion disregard the possibility of basic cognitive and affective processes, and perhaps even some behavioral practices that are common to all members of the human race, regardless of tradition. If the presuppositions underlying such research and its limitations are acknowledged, such research potentially plays a beneficial role. But what I have proposed here does suggest that the lived experience of one's faith will undoubtedly be influenced by its cultural context, including the religious tradition with which the person resides and to which he or she contributes. Indeed, I expect that we will find some commonalities across cultures, but such commonalities should be discovered by a culturally indigenous psychology of religion and not by forcing a Western-based psychological framework on experiences far removed from Western influence. And I point to a lot of Al Duick's work over in China as an example of that. That said, psychologists of religion are far from exhausting the richness of Western Christianity. Thus, it remains a research-fertile culture for the psychology of religion. I have a few minutes here, and I'm at the very end of my talk, so I'm just going to digress for a moment and admit that there is an underlying issue here that I haven't dealt with. And that is that how do you exactly define a culture, and particularly the relevant culture that we're talking about? For instance, in Christianity, we can talk about Korean Christians, we can talk about American Christians, we can talk about Western European Christians, we can talk about the African American church. Within North America, there are Protestant and Catholic Christians. And within Catholicism, there are Jesuits and Franciscans. And within Protestantism, there are denominational cultures, multiple denominational cultures, as well as the grouping of just evangelical and mainline cultures. So a challenge facing a culture-specific psychology of religion is how to define the culture that is relevant to the question at hand. Deciding this sometimes might involve a trade-off. In general, it seems to me that greater richness and depth will be discovered under conditions where you get at a highly specific culture. And one example I used to live in Western Pennsylvania, and I was in a small town, but surrounding the town in the countryside was a very conservative Sixth Order Amish community. And I used to, we were poor, and we'd often buy our furniture at auctions, okay? And that's where the Amish would all show up. And so I would love just to, get away from the auction for a while and go back and, while all the Amish guys were smoking their pipes, I was not doing that. Might have been, no, I wasn't smoking anything. But anyway, when I'd get out there, I'd start talking with these fellows, and it was just fascinating. So I started to do a study, and actually we have a chapter of which I was the primary author in that religious fundamentalism book. And what I discovered was you really have to get in depth with these folks. In order to really understand that it is a theologically rich tradition why they drive buggies. Why, for instance, it was decided to be okay to have a trampoline in a backyard, but that required major decisions. Why They can use a payphone, but not a cell phone. Okay. There's a theology behind it. And you want to know, I mean, I'll simplify it here because we only have a minute or two left. But the simplification of that is, does it add to the redeeming value of the culture? Okay. Does it create a sense of collective identity? So they did allow payphones, but they had to be in very visible locations where the community could see it. You can't go around carrying a cell phone. That's the reason why it's okay to be in buggies, because you can only go so far in a buggy. Okay, it really is rough on the butt, because they usually don't allow cushions just for that reason. Okay, and it's not okay to drive a car. And why an 8th grade education is enough, because that's all you need to plow the land. See? And they've had to fight that in our court system. It's that kind of in-depth analysis that is involved in an emic approach that sometimes we have to get at. So, with that said, we do have to decide at what level we're defining culture, and that's very important. In general, I think the more specific you can be, the more you're getting at it. But the trade-off, of course, is that it's not as generalizable then. And that's a highly valued characteristic of scientific research. So the research that has specifically looked at Christianity, and with this I'll close, is often done in the form of convenience sampling. And it is done so largely through an etic approach, which has failed to probe the depths of the faith experience of Christians. This call for a culture-specific psychology of religion should propel an understanding of Christianity even further. No one is better suited in taking the lead, especially in conducting emic research from an insider perspective, than those of us who identify with the faith and those of us who are trained within the context of a program like Fuller. At the same time, our credibility is at stake, which demands of us a research excellence.